And hello, everyone. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Nora Forsbacka, and I'm the project manager of Bridge 47. And I'm really delighted today to introduce the final keynote of our Imagine 4.7 event. And we're really pleased today to have with us Lisa John, the Secretary General of Civicus, which is a global alliance dedicated to promoting civil society and civic freedoms. And Civicus is a member of the Bridge 47 consortium and family, and we've had the honor and the privilege to collaborate over these last soon 4 years. And Lisa John is passionate about governance, accountability, and social justice, and has spent a large part of her work coordinating large-scale civil society campaigns, including the Don't Break the Promise campaign in India, the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. She has served as head of outreach for the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on the post-2015 agenda, and as the global campaign director for Save the Children International in her previous roles. She's authored several reports, including assessments on the role of the influence of emerging powers. And Lisa has kindly promised to stay with us for a moment after her keynote to discuss with us. So do feel free to, or even encouraged to, post questions in the chat box. And without further ado, Lisa, we're really pleased to have you here. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nora. I jumped in a little earlier than this session, and it was really exciting to see everybody do, the actions or respond to the questions. So really loving the interactive and engaging format of these 3 days. The agenda on the website, starting with mindfulness and kind of centering, I think has been, it looks fantastic and is something we need to do a lot more of. I know, speaking for myself, that I have a activist yoga group every Sunday morning that has kept me sane, an online group that has kept me sane across the past year. So really great to be here, and I'm actually going to take some liberties then with my presentation, because I know that this is a group that's already energized, right, and is not wouldn't mind not sitting and listening to a speech for 10-15 minutes. So yesterday we released our 10th edition of the annual State of Civil Society report. Civicus has been bringing, a kind of an annual commentary on civil society, which is different from the Civicus Monitor, which tracks civic space trends. The State of Civil Society report is, almost like a celebration of the changes and the transformation that civil society in all its diversity and breadth and depth, has been driving across the world across the past decade. So I'm actually going to just speak to a few points in terms of trends and emerging trends in the last 10 years, but also try and see if there's, at least a note of optimism or an opportunity for change or engagement that we can take away, particularly in the context of public engagement, global citizenship, and really inspiring people to, step into the public spheres and influence, if not take charge of, public decision making. So I'm going to try and therefore not paint a picture that is all doom and gloom, because things are quite challenging in many parts of the world. But I'm also going to use the chat function so that, we have an opportunity to just respond to some of the headlines and see what they actually mean to us. So I've actually picked up 5 of the 10 trends that the report actually speaks to, because I felt that they would be most relevant to this group. And I'm going to name them and then invite you to write the first word that comes to mind when I name that headline. And then I'll start talking to what's there in the report. So then it'll be an interesting way of checking whether the evidence we have across the last few years actually resonates with your own personal and political experience wherever you are. So if you're ready for that, then I'll start off now. So the first trend really, and I think something that we're all very, very familiar with, is a state of political flux and the undermining of democratic mechanisms. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to write the first word that pops to mind, or it brings to mind when you hear of this a state of political flux and the undermining of democratic mechanisms? Capitol Hill. Okay. I'm going to wait for at least 5 people to write before I. Okay, great. This is excellent. Hungary, yes, indeed. So I think on this, that there are several really, overarching trends that have come through in the last 10 years. The first, of course, is the rise of right-wing populism and nationalism at a scale that, many of us would have never imagined possible, a decade ago. And along with that, really a context of increased polarization, which really makes even the possibility of having a reasoned debate on democracy, on public participation, on inclusion, really very difficult in many political and public contexts. So linked to that also has been the rise of increasingly complex and sophisticated strategies for restriction and repression of civil society, and the almost almost a space for both state and non-state actors to attack and target civil society and human rights defenders with absolute impunity. So it's been a really a scary time, I think, for everybody who works for social justice or for change, because the ability of large systems, the ability of people, the ability of even the media to go after you, to punish you for dissent has reached a scale that we've never seen before. But in that context, I think the opportunity for groups like yourselves and us is really the emergence of a new cadre of young feminist leaders across the world, and both in national and subnational contexts, and particularly in the context of COVID, we've seen that there is really a sliver of hope in terms of a new set of political leaders, coming to the fore and really changing the context and the substance of the political and public discourse. So I think that's the question I'm going to leave you with, maybe when we get back to our discussion later, because in a sense, this conversation really is about finding the opportunities for us to be proactive and to drive change, right? The second headline, which I'm going to state again and then have a few of you, respond to it, really is the rise of ultra-capitalism and social disinformation economy. So what does that mean to you? So the rise of ultra-capitalism and a disinformation economy. I'm going to give it half a second. Yes. And anybody else? Does it resonate? Does it not resonate? Yes, need for. Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I think all of that speaks quite clearly also to the trends we're seeing. I mean, really, in terms of the essence of it, it's forcing us as civil society to look much more closely at the role of big businesses in how they protect or restrict civic space and civic freedoms. And I think the role of business, particularly with the viral ability to promote misinformation that is being used both by businesses but also by governments, and that ability actually being hardwired into the business model of social media is a trend that I think all of us are feeling the impact of, but really haven't wrapped our heads around in terms of how we hold big tech and other economic actors accountable. But on the other hand, I think what you're seeing is that economic shocks are actually one of the most significant triggers of mass protests around the world. So a lot of protests haven't started off because of the big questions of democracy or economic or social justice. It's really started off because there's been an increase in attacks somewhere, or there's been increase in food prices. So it's really the hard-hitting issues, of income, of social protection, and of course climate action that have driven a lot of mass protests across the world. So in a sense, again, the opportunity we have is that the understanding of economic rights and economic justice is more powerful now and more cross-cutting across contexts than ever before. And it's not a language that's only being spoken by the traditional trade unions or social movements, right? There's a very strong public discourse on the right to social protection systems across the world. And there is, especially with the pandemic, an opportunity to shift both policy dialogue as well as public engagement on these issues. And therefore, I think the question for many civil society formations is, how do we better integrate issues of economic inequality or economic justice and climate justice much more strongly in the work we're doing on human rights and civic space, for instance. And we can't be, I mean, when we speak to publics and when we want to engage publics, a kind of siloed or disintegrated approach to transformation really isn't working as much anymore. And then how do we kind of create that much stronger shared narrative of the change that we're collectively pushing forward or working for? So having said that, I think the third trend really is beleaguered multilateralism, and I think that's a space that all of us play several roles in or spend a lot of time interacting with. So I'm going to stop there and maybe just wait for 2 or 3 reactions to the idea of a beleaguered international system. And if there's someone who hasn't written yet, maybe this is a good time for you to do so. Too heavy reliance on soft law? Anything else? Resurgent nationalism, yes, absolutely. One more. Fragmentation. Excellent. Tanya, you're going to get the gold star for, for comments in the chat. So, so on beleaguered nationalism, I think the idea is that, civil society across the world has traditionally relied quite a lot on international systems to really push and reinforce both laws, both norms and, kind of legal frameworks in a way wherever they exist. But that's something that's also taking a really strong hit in relation to the resurgent right-wing and nationalism, trends. There's a particular tendency among governments to undermine the legitimacy of international systems and processes, but also do so in a way that nationally then allows them to use more militarized and more securitized approaches to dealing with dissent and conflict internally. So on one hand, you're kind of dismantling the systems for actual dialogue and a more meaningful engagement with complex international problems. And on the other hand, you're making the ability to, have a hard repressive response to any call for, divergent thinking or for doing things differently locally much stronger, which again is kind of a kind of a reinforcing cycle, because the citizens or communities locally then just don't have access to any regional or global mechanisms to protect themselves from that kind of backlash. So in that context, I think there's an increasing need for us to be reinforcing the role of international institutions, but also pushing them to reform themselves in order to be more people-centered and more democratic in their own in the way they conduct their own business. And last year was actually the 75th anniversary of the UN, and there's been a lot of work actually on showcasing and spotlighting some really critical changes that the UN, for instance, needs to make in order to be more future relevant. Some of you may have heard of them. There's a campaign called We the Peoples, which has been articulating, the need for a World Citizens Initiative, a civil society envoy, for instance, or a UN, parliamentary assembly. And some of these calls, which maybe 5 years ago felt like a bit of a fantasy, right now feels, so compelling and so urgent in terms of really providing a new democratic framework for, global decision-making as well, including in relation to the Security Council. So that's perhaps an area of work that, many of you all may be engaged with as well, and would be good to unpack a little further. And then finally, I think there are 2 more trends, but I'm just going to speak to them directly. And these are the 2 I think that have a direct relevance in what most of us do. One is really the emergence of a new frontier of civil society and new frontiers for civic action. And the other is really a very, very pervasive ability to address structural injustice or systemic injustice and assert, the difference that's needed. And I think those are two trends which have been extremely positive for the role and relevance of civil society across the world. In the first context, you're seeing, the state of civil society reports actually that we've done constantly show that change, and especially radical and long-term change, is constantly being driven by unusual segments of society. So it's not being driven by established organized civil society. It's being driven by young professionals, by women leaders, by people in contexts where their day-to-day work or lives is not driven by the need to think about social change. So on one hand, of course, it raises the question of how then established civil society needs to redesign and reinvent itself to speak much more strongly to these trends. But on the other hand, it means that we basically have a whole generation of new allies that we can tap into, that we can learn from, that we can reinvent our strategies and approaches with. And that's a huge win, I think, for civil society and its power and legitimacy on the ground. In the second instance, there's really been a sense that traditionally excluded groups have got the political space and the bandwidth actually to make their own views, their own experiences, and their own demands heard at a scale that has never been seen before. So whether it's the Me Too or the Black Lives Matter movements for against homophobia, for instance, or for climate action, the scale at which we've seen public engagement and public support for for calls and for demands which many of us wouldn't even have understood or heard several years ago, has been phenomenal. And I think that again calls for us to be reorganizing the way we approach and drive our work in a way that's much more intersectional and much more justice oriented. So I don't think any of us in the established civil society spaces now can get away with a more kind of one theme, slightly superficial analysis of what the root causes of change or inequality or injustice are. And I think that that's actually good news for us, because it allows us, even in terms of our resourcing and support options, to be much more insistent on long-term change, on the ability to resource civil society and support civil society to think deeply and fundamentally about political and economic structures, and to really reduce our role as a fragmented, short-term, delivery-based, sector, and really kind of reclaim our, original mission as a force for long-term change. So I'm going to stop there, and then we can have a vibrant discussion on, I'm sure, these issues which are very close and passionate for many of you on the group.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for some really insightful points there. I appreciated the point you made about kind of having to take to move beyond the siloed approach and to connect the different struggles. And that's something I think we in Bridge 47 are also trying to do with looking at 4.7 and transformative education as a whole, going beyond just global citizenship education, but also education for sustainable development, peace, gender equality, and so on. So really connecting these different struggles. Now, reminding people to please use the chat to pose questions. But before we go to the chat, just to get the conversation started a little bit, I would have a question for you, Lisa, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
And that connects one of the sessions, or the final session of this week, is going to be about how transformative learning can really help us as civil society do our work better. So transformative learning for powerful civil society. And I think you touched upon that a little bit already in your previous notes, but would be lovely to hear you elaborate on that. What role can transformative education and learning play in building the capacity of civil society and kind of helping us to move towards the directions that we need to move?
So I'm going to hazard some guesses here, because transformative learning could mean many things to many people. At least from where I sit, I think it really requires us to review and challenge our core assumptions on a regular basis. We've all done that, right, as a result of the pandemic, where things we just took for granted in terms of what was working well and what's the most effective way to achieve outcomes or drive change have had to be revisited and radically restructured. So, I mean, at least in a lot of the conversations I'm in, there's really an emphasis on co-design and co-creation, and no matter which group you're with, not to start from a point where you're taking anything for granted. And I think it's quite difficult to do that, both in your own institutional space as well as when you interact with other stakeholders, right? Because civil society, for one of the things we're really proud of is having created norms and standards and frameworks by which we can assess and analyze and interpret what's happening in the rest of the world. But I think there's a real danger of having evolved to such a level of complexity. We have a Civicus youth community, and there's a youth action team that gets elected from the Civicus youth community, once every year or once in 2 years. So I was speaking to the group yesterday, and they were saying that it's really one of the most important attributes of both of leadership, whether it's within your own space or no matter which level of the organization you're in, or in your communities and in the world outside, is the ability to actually really embrace the feminist principles of engagement, where you don't assume that you know everything, and you're really open to your own ignorance, I think, right? Open to kind of sharing, what you don't know, and being able to engage with others on that. And the level at which that is important has really been, demonstrated by the behavior of global leaders. So there was an article, sometime 2 weeks ago about the 5 men who've been the worst, global leaders or national leaders in a global crisis, which includes, Trump from before, but also Narendra Modi from India, the president of Mexico. I mean, so there were these in Brazil, of course. And so I think the whole idea that, you have to, like, a learning mindset is not just about your intellectual ability to absorb new concepts. It's also about your, your demeanor and your attitude towards your own vulnerabilities, and whether you are going to allow yourself to say that you don't know something, and then you're able to kind of work with others to understand and appreciate how you're creating something newer and more relevant, right? But I think civil society has not been resourced to do that well. And for me, a lot of the challenges we face ultimately comes back to the resourcing model of civil society, because we've been resourced to compete with each other. We've been resourced to demonstrate short-term gains, short-term wins, and the need. I mean, when we work in the field of education, we're talking about how you don't want students to feel like they have to be competitive, that they have to earn the highest mark, that they have to keep being, demonstrating actions that prove them to be winners in order to get an investment, right, for learning. But that's exactly how we treat civil society organizations. I mean, even the smallest grassroots organization is expected to know how to fill, or create a proposal which, is incredibly complex, which is in a language that most grassroots organizations don't understand. And I think just the infrastructure that we operate in sets us up for failure in terms of learning and transformation. And I think that's where we really need to challenge, resourcing and recognition patterns within civil society. It was a very long answer to your question.
Thank you. That was really, really inspiring. We do have a few more questions coming from the audience now. One question from Kirsty is about needing to work together, with different stakeholders across boundaries, even with those that we don't agree with. And she's asking about that blurred line of when do we engage in dialogue and when do we stop and say enough is enough, and we're not able to collaborate. How would you approach that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I definitely don't want to speak to anybody, anybody in the Indian government right now. Of course, I live in South Africa, but yeah, I think it's really a matter of a values check. And that's what we do in our own lives as well, right? When you're in a toxic relationship, you're not going to want to engage with them if they're really clear crossing certain boundaries. But one suggestion, which actually I got from the AGNA, the network of national associations that Civicus works with, a group which was so illuminating for me was the fact that, we for instance, produced the Civicus Monitor, where we track civic freedoms across countries. But what they were suggesting to us is that you actually need to create a template to track political parties and political candidates before they get into power. So your ability to actually dialogue has to come in before a person becomes so powerful, or the balance of power is so twisted that there's no opportunity to make a difference, right? And that's something now I've been really talking quite a lot about within Civicus, because the need now to engage with democracy and the politics of democracy, so election cycles, political candidates, political parties, has to be much further ahead and much more proactive than waiting till some authoritarian gets into power and then you're kind of having a breakdown in conversation. So it's not a really clear answer. There is no yes and no or black and white answer to that, but I think finding the areas for engagement well in advance of a serious power imbalance. And again, I would say, bring it back to our personal spaces as well. You need to change and challenge toxic behavior before it gets, to an extent where it's completely disruptive. And I think, as someone who's worked on campaigning pretty much all my life, I think we've really the ability to actually engage communities, to engage publics, to make it literally cost effective for someone who doesn't work in this sector to track and be part of some of these change processes has really reduced a lot. I started my work in this sector as a community organizer. I don't see that designation in most organizations anymore. So I think, really getting back to the roots of who we are. Civil society is ultimately an expression of citizen action or civic action. And that's something we should never forget or distance ourselves from. And that's what gives us, the resilience and the legitimacy on the ground, right? So I think those are the thoughts you've triggered for me with your question.
Thank you, Lisa. And the point there about kind of needing to be very proactive, but also having everyone on board and working together to challenge these toxic behaviors before they become kind of the main. I'm aware we're very short on time. I would love to give time for just one more question, if that's okay. A very short answer, hopefully. And that question comes from Frank, and it comes on the role of you mentioned this need to kind of work across silos, work together, and he's talking about the role of networks in supporting that. So to create the space for members to work on their kind of the things that create the fire in their bellies. But for the networks to create these spaces to come together and connect all these struggles. So how would you reflect on the role of the networks and how they can support this intersectional work, and how also members can work differently within their networks or platforms?
So one of the things we're doing actually is launching a whole new area of work on the right to peaceful assembly in Civicus. So we're going to be working on that as a very specialized theme across the next 5 years. In all of the conversations we've had with both regional and local actors, the biggest kind of outcome that people are asking for is better and stronger ways of expressing international solidarity. And the experience that a lot of groups who challenge governments have is that mainstream and established civil society doesn't step in, it doesn't make its voice heard, it doesn't do whatever it can to if not protect, at least reinforce what grassroots groups on the ground who are really struggling, and many of them have been imprisoned or attacked or even killed for challenging either state or non-state actors. They don't see that support coming very quickly, and there's an intent to support on the other side, but the means to get together and do something that's meaningful isn't I mean, maybe it's available, but isn't activated very fast. So I think there's a need for us to, kind of really look at where, I mean, we all don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time, but really look at where, I mean, two things. One, there's always been a culture of statements, for instance, and that's been the easiest or the quickest way for us to express, to condemn or to express concern about development. But in my experience and in the experience that we have through Civicus, I've seen that it's really targeted action that delivers, but it's also the kind of action that the least number of people are willing to take. And there's probably two reasons for that. One is that we genuinely don't have those public and political relationships where we can immediately reach somebody in a government space or in a kind of a larger public space and generate that kind of visible reaction. So one, we don't have the contacts. So the only contacts and the only people we're speaking to is each other. So the only thing we can do is write a statement and put it out. But our role really should be to build those relationships. And it comes back to the first question, right, of our allies and our stakeholders. I mean, all of us should have at least one ally in a sector beyond our own who can be activated when there's a crisis. And I think doing that better, to find, and it doesn't have to be always high level like heads of state. It can be a network of schools. It can be a network of lawyers. It can be a network of teachers. But any network that represents some, kind of some section of society which can state an opinion and legitimize what is what is being asked for. And maybe one of my favorite examples of that was very recently with the attacks on Palestine. It was a group of South African medical workers who came up and put out a statement to their government saying, to the South African government saying that you need to take a stand on this because it is health workers there who are also getting affected, and it is health workers from South Africa. So I found that really inspiring because it wasn't just, again, a set of civil society organizations putting out a statement that nobody knows who has read or has seen. It is like, the organizing of another section of society and them using their relationship with the government to push the government to take a stand. And I think for me, solidarity really should be about us being very, very creative about how we do that. And it doesn't only need to be political. When we speak to a lot of young protesters, one of their major issues is just the social support and the mental health support. I mean, a lot of the protesters in Hong Kong, for instance, were young students. They were being kind of closed in their universities. They had people working like overnight and overtime, providing psychological support to protesters, because for many of them, they're actually taking to the streets at an age even before they can legitimately become a voter. So for many people who are young today, their first form of democratic action is actually being part of a violent protest, and not violent, not because of their action, violent because of the way that the government is disproportionately cracking down on them. And I think those are the kind of, more nuanced, non-advocacy type supports also that we need to be, able to connect and generate very quickly.
Thank you, Lisa. That's really, really insightful and good points about the role of that networks can play. We're out of time. It always happens. I feel like we would have so much more to talk about. But thank you so much, Lisa, for joining us today and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, everyone, for all the excellent questions. Now, I've been made aware that we do have a graphic recording that is taking place, and you can see it here. It looks really wonderful. We will be sharing this, of course, on social media and with you as well later on. So thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone. And I am now handing over to my colleague, Alan, to give us an update on what comes next.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Lisa. This was so inspiring. It really lit up a fire in me, and I hope it was the same for others. I'm leaving this session with really this strong will to keep on keeping on what we are doing and really keep on fighting for